Dr. Dirk Moses, who is presently the Woodrow Wilson Australian Scholar. In addition to various other competitions we have to bring scholars here, we also hold a separate competition open only to Australian citizens or residents of Australia, because we decided a couple years ago that Washington did not know enough about Australia or pay enough attention to what, after all, is one of our very best friends in the world. So we have this special competition. We invite applications not only from academicians, but also journalists, lawyers, business people, people from civil society. Really the only two criteria we have is that you are doing research on issues of contemporary policy relevance, and that you be very, very talented. And Dirk Moses clearly fits both those criteria. Dirk is here at the center. Unfortunately, he's about to leave us. This was his next to last week with us. He's looking at international reactions to allegations of genocide during decolonization in the 1960s and 1970s. This presentation today, which focuses on the succession of East Pakistan in 1971, which ultimately led, of course, to the creation of the new nation of Bangladesh. This is the presentation he's going to give us today, but it's part of this broader study of international reactions to several allegations of genocide. Dirk is, probably was, professor of history at the University of Sydney. And the reason I say was is because he resigned that position immediately prior to joining us earlier this fall, and from here heads off to Florence, where he has assumed a new position as professor of global and colonial history at the European University Institute in Florence. Dirk, we're delighted to have you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Bob. As it's one of my final days here at the Wilson Center, it's in order that I give some thanks for the 3 months I've had here. So first, thanks to the Asia program that you run and yourself for the invitation to work here, study here, and research here for 3 months, and to your staff, Michael Kugelman, Bryce Wakefield, and other members of the Asia program. Janet in the library has been incalculably helpful, as is her staff as well, and then my intern, who can't be here today, was also greatly helpful in gathering much material. Right now I'm spending each day over in Maryland, where the National Archives are located, photographing as many State Department documents on this issue as much as possible, which goes to show that I'm not going to be talking about the American position today, which is rather well known in the event, because I've collected those documents but not studied them yet. I'm going to be talking about the British view, the British views about this perspective, because I have copied those documents in the PRO in London and have had some time to look over them.
So we'll have to invite you back to compare the British and American perspectives.
Yeah, no daylight between them. Well, there was, as you'll see from this document, there was at least initially some daylight between them. We'll look at that later on. Now, my current project, as Bob said, researches the construction of international humanitarian sensibility after the Second World War. Now, to that end, I'm studying how the international community reacted to claims of genocide and civil wars, international conflicts, and national liberation struggles since the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide in 1948. Genocide was widely alleged in Asian and African post-colonial conflict, for example, in and about Rwanda in 1963-64, in Nigeria, Biafra in the late 60s, during the conflict in East Pakistan in 1971, and then in Burundi a year later. So you can see that there's a wave of these kind of conflicts, often secessionist conflicts at this time. Now, by drawing on documents in the archives of the United Nations, both in New York and in Geneva, and the various countries to which I have access, the UK, Germany, Austria, and hopefully, when I can get there, India and Bangladesh as well, and hope Bangladesh and Islamabad, why not, as well as media and NGO archives, I aim to reconstruct how states, non-state actors, humanitarian agencies, and the media understood and depicted these events in different ways. Now, this paper today focuses, as you know, on the events of 1971, as the International Commission of Jurists called its report, which it put out a year later. The research is ongoing and therefore incomplete. For this paper, I draw on hitherto largely unused British documents from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. The documents from other archives will be incorporated after later research trips. As the following is a work in progress, it's not quite properly balanced in coverage, and much more material could be quoted from sources in some sections and perhaps less in others. And because I cannot claim expertise in South Asian history, it was originally trained in German history actually, I welcome the input of expert colleagues in South Asia in developing the paper. The paper deals, as I said, mainly with the British reactions to the violence in East Pakistan, mainly between March and June 1971, and I'll leave aside the US reaction for now. It concludes with a brief reflection about the international community's civil war and genocide. Now, be warned, it contains extensive quotations from the British diplomatic cables, and you have one of those in front of you, as well as parliamentary debates. But such attention, I hope, will help us understand how a vested great power in such a crisis reasons in terms of rival categories of analysis, which are basically going to be civil war on one hand, which was the government position in the UK, versus the opposition's view that it was a genocide and should be framed in those terms. Now, Pakistan was an ally of Britain, formalised through two pacts in the mid-1950s, designed to buffer Asia against Soviet encroachment. At the same time, the relationship with India remained of signal importance based on historical connections and that country's size and status in the region. Managing these relationships was a sometimes precarious juggling act, and the High Commissions in Delhi, Islamabad and Dhaka and elsewhere in Asia were in constant communication to ensure their colleagues at the FCO in London were apprised of local events, feelings and perceptions. It goes without saying that the imperatives of the officials in situ, in East Pakistan, for example, did not always accord with those of the Foreign Secretary, at that time Sir Alec Hume Douglas, and the Cabinet, who had, of course, a whole-of-government perspective. Other players in the British sphere were dissident members of Parliament or opposition members of Parliament with agendas of their own. They pressured the government in the House of Commons and in the media, which itself exerted an independent force by highlighting aspects of the conflict that did not suit the government. Humanitarian and relief organisations also mobilised to raise consciousness about the suffering in East Pakistan and India and to raise and deliver aid to these places. They too challenged the government position. The same constellation was evident in the United States domestic sphere, though there was considerable tension, it appears, between US diplomats in Dhaka and the State Department on the one hand and the White House on the other. But as I said, that's not a story I'm telling today. Now, US and British diplomats were in regular contact and reported on one another's thinking on particular issues. Let's start in early March 1971, when the East Pakistan non-cooperation campaign had commenced against Yahya Khan's postponement of the foreshadowed National Assembly. You all know that in late 1970, the Awami League won the elections of that time, that a constitutional assembly or a national assembly was to be called to draw up a new constitution, but that the negotiations broke down. Yahya Khan postponed the National Assembly, and this led to a non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement in the East in March. Now, we will see that the violent conflict that ensued was predicted well in advance. The British interlocutor in Washington, D.C. reported on the 6th of March that, quote, the US assessment was that the Pakistan Army would intervene despite the obvious difficulties presented. By geography and by India's refusal to allow Pakistani overflights, this could result in serious bloodshed. So almost 20 days before the Pakistan Army's crackdown on Operation Searchlight, the Americans were predicting serious bloodshed, and so were the British. Now, the British High Commissioner in Islamabad, Sir Cyril Pickard, a long-time FCO Mandarin, was in regular contact with West Pakistan elites, of course he was based in Islamabad, and set the tone and line on Pakistan for the FCO as a whole. He doubted the Americans' premise that, and this is, I'm quoting now from the document you have in front of you, this is the bottom half, that at all costs bloodshed must be avoided, presumably on the basis that the use of military force would be ineffective even in the short term. And he reminded all that, quote, "The main point is that Yahya Khan and his advisers are convinced that it's their duty and within their capacity to hold the situation, if necessary, by force." His pragmatic conclusion was that, and I continue the quotation, "it would be quite fruitless at this stage and extremely dangerous to our interest to try to persuade them otherwise," unquote. Now, British interests would be served, he said in another cable, by delivering a personal message of understanding from the Prime Minister. In the event, he drafted the wording of the message that Edward Heath then sent to Yahya Khan. Now, back in London, the South Asia Department of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office was less inclined than Picard to see the likely success of any West Pakistan military crackdown. It was much closer to the Americans' assessment. Sunderland, who was the senior bureaucrat there at the South Asia desk, advised that Yahya Khan should be encouraged to compromise with the Mujib and accept his 6 points, for otherwise, he said, the consequences are likely to be disastrous. Well before Operation Searchlight, already then on the 11th of March, he predicted its ultimate outcome, and I quote him, "It is possible that in the short term he and the army could hold with considerable bloodshed," this is a term that recurs, "the East for a short period, but they could not maintain this position indefinitely," unquote. So he thought, in other words, trying to smash the Awami League was bound to fail, and of course he was right. Now, Picard's line prevailed, however, even though he was not uncritical of West Pakistan policy. A particularly revealing conversation was held between the British High Commissioner, or Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka, FCD Sargent, and a senior legal advisor to Mujib, later the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, Dr. Kamil Hossain, on the 12th of March. Hossain said that Mujib was convinced that, quote, "the army intends to maintain the integrity of Pakistan even if it means killing many Bengalis." And he continued that Yahya Khan's planned visit to Dhaka for negotiations with Mujib was just a pretext to world opinion so that the Awami League could be made to look like an extremist separatist party. And he continued with these words, "By this means, it is hoped to be able to convince the world that genocide in Pakistan would be justified." Now, these are Hussein's words. In other words, the Bengalis were saying the Pakistanis are going to commit genocide against us, and they're even using that word genocide 2 weeks before the operation started. So either we can think that this is propaganda to get the British attention, or that they genuinely feared this. I actually think it's probably a mixture of both. Dr. Hussein's message, now this is now the British summary of the conversation, was, quote, "It was up to the developing world, or the developed world, to bring pressure to bear on the present regime in Pakistan to prevent an impending disaster." And the summary of his words continues. Now this is now the British describing the conversation with Hussein. Hussein said he knew that governments were not activated by idealism in the conduct of their foreign policies, but the world would be a loser if mass slaughter took place in Pakistan to maintain the status quo. The military could be readily brought to their senses if sufficient pressure was applied in Islamabad by those countries which help support the Pakistan economy. He ended by saying that if Bengalis are to die alone, what they ask now was the world should know why they were going to be destroyed, unquote. So you can see an incredible anxiety on the part of the Bengali and the Awami leadership. Even so, the diplomats saw that a civil war was unfolding rather than a genocide, certainly in March. Reports about two sorts of violence elsewhere in East Pakistan, so outside Dhaka, began to arrive regularly. On the one hand, between the army and civilians, and on the other, between East Pakistani civilians. A situation report on the 9th of March noted that official casualty figures from clashes between the population and the government troops during the previous weeks were 172 killed and 358 injured, although the Awami League insisted they were much higher and then demanded an inquiry. Deep animosity felt towards the army was evinced in what the British called pinpricks from the party, the Awami League and the public, evidenced by the cutting off of food and fuel supplies to the cantonments or the barracks in which the army was confined largely at this point. British officials were more worried about nationalist students, Bengali nationalist students, who seemed to be increasingly powerful, they said. For example, on the 10th of March, they set up checkpoints throughout Dhaka, although they were prevailed upon to take them down. A few days later, they held a Resistance Day parade to coincide with the Pakistan national holiday in order to humiliate Yahya Khan during his visit. They remain a constant threat, the British note in their cables. They have the use of stolen transport as well as a variety of weapons. Earlier, nationalist students had told a British traveller, the diplomats noted, that they had robbed laboratories to make weapons and were fortifying buildings for the coming showdown with the army. The army's restraint, as the British diplomats put it, in the face of such provocations was noted and admired. The Awami League, they also noted, controlled the streets of Dhaka while the army was confined to barracks. The situation was explosive, but again, one gets the sense, as a civil war rather than as a genocide. Now, violence among civilians, now these are the second kind of reports that were coming in March, confirmed the impression of a civil war rather than a genocide. Of course, a genocide implies a one-sided state violence against civilians, whereas civil war implies reciprocity and symmetry. Now, reports from Chittagong were coming in about conflicts between the Bihari minority and Bengalis, which it was noted were more bitter than witnessed before. The arson was greater, and in some circumstances, Biharis have firearms which they use to defend themselves against Bengalis. These are quotations from the cables. In the villages, the cables continue, there are processions calling for a free Bengal and death to Punjabis. Non-Bengalis were also being murdered and decapitated in Tongi. Sargent, the Deputy High Commissioner, noted dryly, and I quote him, "The Awami League naturally tries to play down this side of the present crisis, namely violence against defenceless non-Indigenous Asians, which has been far more widespread than in incidents with the army," unquote. The atmosphere in Barisal was bad, he noted, and even Westerners were object of Bengali hostility. And he continues in this vein. These are just some selections. The diplomats seem to have been surprised by the breakdown of negotiations between the Awami League and the Pakistan leadership in late March, and the military takeover on the 25th and early on the 26th. The situation and extent of the violence was unclear for a few days, largely confined to their offices and amid the gunfire. They could do little more than pass on reports of the media, as journalists were out in the streets observing events. A typical quotation was, "Press also reports resumption of shooting last night, the Awami League being cold-blooded army killing of unarmed civilians, official version alleging use of army to restore law and order," unquote. Pickard in Islamabad said he now feared bloodshed on a large scale, and he told his staff that our first consideration must be the safety of our own nationals. The violence was confirmed from Dhaka by Sargent there, who reported his meeting with an Awami League official the next day. He was told that about 300 people were killed on the first night, and he asked, and the Awami League official had asked that the matter should be raised in the Security Council, the UN, with particular emphasis on genocide. So again, this use of the word genocide. He also told the British that his comrades would abscond to the countryside, whence they would fight a war of national liberation, which of course did occur. By now, 2 days after the crackdown had commenced, Sargent in Dhaka had a better idea of the situation, although there were still no communications from outside the capital. And as usual, these resembled an extensive or excessive law and order operation rather than a genocide. And I quote his cable, "The whole area of Kutuch, where there are huts and small shops, have deliberately fired and the owners machine-gunned. Plans have been laid to deal similarly with other areas of the old town today, with villages beyond the Kulshum area tonight. The campaign is admitted by the army to be a punitive one against the enemies of the people. The police force is said to be largely shot down," by which he means the Bengali police force. "The firing last night in the East Pakistani Rifle Regiment headquarters suggests that at least some of that force are still resisting. Total casualties are put at about 5,000. The indications are that the army has planned a reign of terror, and in this it has so far been largely successful." In another telegram the same day, he reported the indiscriminate murder of staff and students at the Dhaka University, and he worried about the nearby British Council office, which of course he recommended closing straight away. Within a few days then, the extent of the violence was clearer, but again it seemed typical of a civil war rather than genocidal. Really, it was just heavy-handed government attempts to prevent secession or civil war. Pakistan police and regiments were attacked, as were students who were known to be armed. What is more, Pickard in Islamabad blamed the failure of negotiations on Mujib, who he regarded as a weak man who had capitulated to the intransigent supporters and hardliners in his own party, and had demanded too much from Yahya Khan, Ali Bhutto and the army. The army told the British and the Americans that they would secure the situation within a few days, though the diplomats continued to think that the army underestimated the extent of popular Awami League support in the population. The military governor, Tikar Khan, even addressed the Bengali accusations of genocide that were for him linked to wildly exaggerated casualties by the press, especially the Indian press. And I quote him, "Nearly everything in the press is misrepresented and the foreign press has been thoroughly malicious. They talk of genocide when the army kills only 27 people in a thoroughly restrained manner." You have to remember at the same time the British are reporting 5,000 casualties. Echoing the now common complaint in Pakistan, he said the problem was that, quote, correspondents are based in Delhi where they absorbed only the Indian viewpoint. Awami League's requests for intervention and intercession fell on deaf ears with the British mandarins, because their imperative, of course, was the welfare of British nationals, which depended on good relations with the army, which would have to protect them and assist in any evacuation. I'll mention this point again below. When the Pakistan Foreign Secretary complained to Picard about the BBC's use of Indian sources in its reporting of the conflict, Picard pointed out that the British government did not control the BBC, and that the Pakistanis had in fact expelled journalists who were now therefore in India. But he did his best to placate his hosts. He wrote to London that, quote, he should be grateful for anything which could be done with the British press to ensure that their reports are reasonably balanced at this critical stage. But there was little chance of the government line being towed when English journalists were eyewitnesses, as we can see when Sargent wrote to his superiors in London, and I quote now Sargent, who of course is the Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka. Simon Dring of the Daily Telegraph escaped the roundup of journalists in Dhaka by the army, and he's hiding in the Intercontinental Hotel. He has not appealed to me for protection. He hopes to leave by air today on the 28th of March. He witnessed the destruction of the offices of the People newspaper, and he has seen the charred bodies of the Sittafak newspaper building, which he describes as cold-blooded murder. He also has seen the shambles at the Iqbal University student hostel, where 200 students are believed to have died. When Dring gets out, our relations with Pakistan will take a plunge for the worse. And indeed they did. He wrote then prominent articles in the Daily Telegraph, especially one on the 31st of March, which detailed all this in a very long series of articles. Picard now had no illusions about the violence, but still it seemed essentially political, directed against political enemies, rather than indiscriminately at civilians. And I quote him, "The reaction of some West Pakistanis is most unpleasant to contemplate. Punjabi and Pathan contempt for the Bengali has risen to the surface, and there is much talk of teaching them a lesson. It's clear from reports reaching us that the army is acting with callous disregard and is adopting terror tactics to cow the Bengalis. Political leaders are being hunted down and shot." And then he notes in sarcastic parenthesis, "There is no precedent for this in Pakistan history. And I expect to find that much of the Awami League leadership has been eliminated." Unlike the American diplomats in Dhaka, therefore, he continued to cast the conflict in terms of a bloody civil war rather than a genocide. As you know, in the famous Archer Blood cables, they used the word genocide from very early on. This was the message received in London and communicated to the British public. As the British Foreign Secretary told the House of Commons in late April, so a month after the crackdown, and I quote him, "We reacted very quickly to the horrible events that took place in Pakistan, but these things do take place in civil wars." Now, the FCO was well aware that the Awami League possessed a mandate for autonomy in Pakistan as a result of the election victory, and was equally conscious that the Pakistan military excesses were making a united Pakistan an increasingly illusory proposition. Hoping for a political settlement, the British advised Yahya to initiate the transition to civilian government by soliciting the support of accessible and supportive Awami League leaders. They consistently pressed Yahya on Mujib's welfare after he was arrested in the first days of the crackdown. And they said that development aid was contingent on the stability of East Pakistan. They certainly did not like the violence, which reminded them of the police state of '64. Picard noting, "I would expect the military to be arrogant, hectoring, and very touchy." But he considered it, and the army violence, to be the inevitable feature of civil war. And neither, it seems, did he expect much more from the Pakistani military. This combination of haughty distaste for the army's actions combined with realpolitik was captured beautifully by Sargent's telegram from Dhaka on the 29th of March, the third day of the crackdown. And I quote now from the telegram. I called on General Farman Ali on 28th of March by appointment. His part in massacring his countrymen seemed to have left him jaded and dispirited, but he was friendly. I love that turn of phrase. I asked him for news of conditions about anything he may have heard of the British communities in Chittagong, around Sylhet, at Barisal and Khulna. I made the point that the best advertisement for Pakistan was their safety and stability so they could get on with their business. End of quotation. Now, the official government line, I believe, was riddled with contradictions, this is the British one, and hidden by self-interest and the norm of state legitimacy. It saw Pakistan as a vulnerable state and wanted to prevent its dissolution to safeguard British and Western interests. Stability was the imperative. At the same time, it did not think that the Western wing could defeat the Bengali resistance movement, and it feared that ultimately the army would, as it wrote, stay secure in their cantonments and let the economic situation look after itself with all that it would mean. In other words, virtual anarchy in the crippling of British economic interests in the country, which were not just based around tea but also jute, and the jute was milled in Dundee in Scotland, which is an economically depressed place anyway. So once these exports are stopped, it has immediate impact on the parts of the British economy. So this was really one of their main priorities, as well as geopolitical stability. Now, the commitment to the principle of state sovereignty and the non-interference in the internal affairs of another state was hegemonic at the FCO and the Tory British government. It's not without significance that the local diplomats needed to rely on the Pakistan army, which controlled the airfields, after all, to expedite an evacuation of British subjects from East Bengal. Good relations with the army were paramount, and so it resisted calls to condemn the military violence that so alienated the population and rendered unlikely the negotiated settlement that they were seeking. There was no point in pressuring Pakistan by withholding aid, the diplomats and the politicians insisted, as Yahya Khan only took advice from friends, and ruining the Pakistani economy benefited no one. Let's look now to the public justification and debate in the House of Commons. Questions were asked in the House of Commons as MPs expressed concern about the violence and the safety of British nationals and increasingly concerns about British policy. Labour MPs led the way in this regard. The Leader of the Opposition consistently suggested to the government that it respect the wishes of the 1970 election and support the self-determination of East Pakistan. A group of MPs went on a parliamentary delegation to India and East Pakistan in June to see for themselves. They returned espousing the Bengali and Indian narrative and contradicted the government's position on every turn. Where the FCO officials advised the government that the Bengalis possessed negligible fighting forces, Bruce Douglas Mann told the House of Commons that in his talks with, and I quote him, with the Prime Minister of independent Bangladesh, the war will continue when West Pakistan is forced out. Because, he said, the Bengalis had the capacity to do so. And of course he witnessed the secretive training camps on the Indian side of the border where the Indians helped train the Mukti Bahini and so forth, which of course was always denied by the Indians at the time. The Labour MPs urged the cessation of aid using, quote, whatever international pressure we can exert to compel West Pakistan to withdraw its troops from East Pakistan, to allow the government of Bangladesh, the Awami League, to take over the administration of East Pakistan. Typical of the government's distance from the British opposition and much of the media was this exchange in the House of Commons on the 29th of March, 2 days after the Pakistan Army's crackdown. Here's now the question to the government. Will the Foreign Secretary impress upon the Pakistan government the abhorrence felt by very many people in this country at the brutal and repressive measures which they are taking against the East Bengali people? And will he impress upon them also that we are most concerned that their troops should be withdrawn, that the killing should stop, and that Sheikh Mujib and his followers should not be the victims of oppression? Further, will the right honourable gentleman do everything in his power to impress upon the Pakistan government that the people of Bengal have the right to decide their own future and, if need be, to decide on separate future for themselves? And this is their reply from the British Foreign Secretary. It just ignores everything that's just been said. I do think it would not be helpful for me to comment on this matter at this time. Everyone abhors violence. The President of Pakistan, as we understand it, was faced with a situation in which his country might be divided in half. We must allow the Pakistan authorities to deal with the matter without our intervention. 11 weeks later, the government had to admit that, quote, fear played a part in the unfolding refugee crisis, which of course they didn't really understand only 2 days after the crackdown. It really unfolded in the next 2 months. But he implied that this fear was a subjective construction of the facts, and I quote the government's position. The East Bengalis, many of whom were Hindus, that is among the refugees, fled because they felt that the Pakistan army was using measures to suppress the population which were intolerable to them, which is of course very euphemistic language. Douglas Hume told the Commons vaguely of the wounds of civil war that are still open, which he said hampered political negotiations. Now, the opposition members would not be assured by such dissembling. John Stonehouse, who had close links to the East English Bengali community, pointed out that by concentrating merely on the problem of refugees, we would be diverted from the horrors that are continuing in East Bengal, he said. And he quoted at length from affidavits obtained from refugees in India that attested to the Pakistan army terror. So there he was, quoting from the refugees themselves and putting it on the record in hindsight. This was not civil war, he said, it was genocide, and I quote him. These declarations, and there are many other hundreds of thousands of witnesses who have been able to articulate their experiences, are witness to the evidence of the most awful genocide. This is not too strong a word to use, since Hitler started the extermination of the Jews in Europe. There is surely a point at which the world community must say that this horror and barbarism has passed the stage at which it is no concern at large to the world. It has passed the stage of a mere internal affair about which we cannot concern ourselves directly. And it becomes a matter with which the world community must take note and must attempt to do something about. Government members responded by accusing Stonehouse of inflaming communal disturbances, and that which they said was really responsible for the refugee crisis. For that reason, they said, the task of long-term reconciliation should be emphasized, rather than incendiary talk of genocide. Indeed, the core problem, they said, was communal riots, which made a communal settlement very difficult. What the British government spokespeople consistently did was refer back to partition and say, look, the Hindus and the Muslims have never been able to get on. We've never been able to really create peace there. And look, they're continuing the violence of before. So in other words, once again, it's a narrative a bit like civil war, communal violence. That's the frame rather than the genocide frame, which implies one-sided state violence against innocent and passive civilians. Again, the opposition surgically probed the government's case. Michael Barnes, who had visited refugee camps in India, responded directly. He said, the Foreign Secretary also spoke of the wounds of war. But the civil war proper, such as it was, lasted only a matter of days. The wounds that the refugees bear are not wounds from civil war, but wounds from a deliberately unleashed wave of atrocity, such as was described by my right honourable friend, the member for Wednesbury, whom I quoted before. As to the communal violence thesis, Peter Shaw noted that the refugee crisis was not the result of what he called sporadic and uncontrolled explosions of communal violence. Reiterating the opposition critique, he declared, it has been brought about by the actions of a highly disciplined army. And regarding this talk of reconciliation, he asked plaintively, how can a dead person be reconciled? Again, eyewitnesses, but this time English living in Pakistan, were quoted at length in their speeches. And one of them was quoted as saying the following, until March, I reckoned that Pakistan had a better record than India in the treatment of minorities. But now it is genocide, with the killing of Hindus only because they're Hindus, and with Muslims killing not only Hindus but also their co-religionists as well. People everywhere are being terrorized. The opposition finally forced the government to reckon with the matter of genocide directly when it tabled an early day motion for Parliament on the 15th of June, and I quote the motion. that this House believes that the widespread murder of civilians and the atrocities on a massive scale by the Pakistan Army in East Bengal, contrary to the United Nations Genocide Convention signed by Pakistan itself, confirms that the military government of Pakistan has forfeited all rights to rule in East Bengal, following its wanton refusal to accept the democratic will of the people as expressed in the December 1970 election. It therefore believes that the United Nations Security Council must be called urgently to consider the situation both as a threat to international peace and as a contravention of the Genocide Convention. And it further believes that until order is restored under United Nations supervision, the provisional government of Bangladesh should be recognised as a vehicle for the expression of self-determination of the people of East Bengal. Now, in response, the parliamentary clerk asked the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to brief the government's leader of the House for an answer, advising that the line to take was that the matter should not be considered in Parliament. The FCO brief encapsulated the incoherence of the government position, refusing to condemn the government violence in public or private on the one hand, also refusing to countenance Security Council discussion, by the way, thereby, on the other hand, leaving the government in charge while acknowledging its violent practices. These reports were coming in all the time. After all, the brief noted, and I quote it, "We have had reports that the Pakistan armed forces continue to act with brutality against the remaining Hindu members of the population in East Pakistan," and in his further confidential message of 11 June to President Yahya Khan, the Prime Minister has urged restraint and the urgent need for progress towards a political settlement and a resumption of normal life and conditions in which the refugees could be encouraged to return to India. Unquote. What is more, a minute from a United Nations official informed the government that, quote, "it could be held that the events in East Pakistan show that the government of Pakistan are in breach of the Genocide Convention. It would certainly be difficult to argue that they are not." The good news, though, for the government, the brief continued, was that the question is merely academic, since the other government most closely involved, India, will not be able to bring the matter to the International Court because the consent of all affected parties is required. And then it went into the technical international law legal details about why such a procedure could not occur. Of course, there was no such international court at the time. And because the consenting parties, above all Pakistan, wouldn't agree to it going any further, that was the end of the matter. And that was that. Although the government continued to receive reports from Dhaka, so this is during June and July, that, quote, "civil war waged with murderous severity by the West Pakistan side is continuing." The government replied consistently that while it deplored the violence, it could and would not interfere in Pakistan's affairs. But the most significant aspects of its stance was the framing of the conflict as a civil war and a tragedy brought on largely by Awami League intransigence. There was killing on both sides, they insist, against Labour MPs, highlighting of the army violence against Bengali civilians. Even in the London Times, Peter Hazelhurst, the main correspondent, consistently reported the massacres of Biharis, the non-indigenous, non-Bengalis in East Pakistan, who were murdered in mass massacres by Awami League supporters in the Awami League itself in revenge attacks for allegedly collaborating with the army. Furthermore, since it was first and foremost a domestic matter for Pakistan, the British said the Security Council should not be involved and the UN should not play a peacekeeping role as the Bengalis and opposition had wanted. In substance, the UK position accorded with that of Pakistan itself, which issued a white paper in August justifying its position. All the while, relief organisations like Oxfam raised money and delivered aid, and by September it moved publicly into the political realm and campaigning for a political solution, which should be driven along by the British rather than the British passively sitting aside. As might be expected, the East Pakistan position received a much more sympathetic hearing in the British public. The newspapers frequently editorialise about it. For example, the London Times 29 times, the Daily Telegraph 39 times, and so forth. There was enormous public attention in Britain in 1971. Only a few days after the crackdown, the Bangladesh Students' Action Committee in London said that the murder of innocent civilians was, quote, pure and simple genocide. Once again, this term was used from the beginning, and it conducted a hunger strike outside Downing Street demanding British recognition of Bangladesh pressure on the Pakistan government, and the raising of the matter in the UN under the Genocide Convention. And a week later, about 2,000 East Pakistan residents in London protested on the streets. Conclusion. What conclusions can we draw from this micro-episode? Unfortunately, time limitations preclude me from mentioning the debates within the UN itself. I've given another paper which is being published in a book on the UN aspect. But I can inform you that the international consensus was against the Indian and the Soviet sympathies for the Bengalis. The great powers, especially China, but also the Arab and Muslim states, were firmly in Pakistan's camp, deploring Indian meddling in the affairs of her neighbour and defending Pakistan's right to put down a secessionist rebellion. Civil wars, which the world had witnessed in Nigeria only a few years earlier, pitted rival principles of the UN against one another. On the one hand, Article 2.7 of its Charter guarantees non-interference in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. And on the other, the rival principle, it states that, quote, to develop friendly relations among nations based on the principle of the equal rights and self-determination of other of peoples, etc., etc. And the Bengalis constantly invoked self-determination. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, pointed to their right to essentially put down a domestic conflict, and therefore the illegitimacy of foreign interference, and even the commenting on their affairs in UN committees and so forth. What is more, the Pakistan government insisted in its reply to the Human Rights Commission of the UN, which had raised the matter of these human rights abuses, that, quote, under conditions, and I quote now from the Pakistan position, this is what I found in the archives in Geneva, under conditions of national emergency and war, derogation from international standards of human rights observance are expressly allowed. In other words, the Pakistan army would ignore the laws of war, which protected civilians and prisoners of war, because such laws do not apply to internal security emergencies. And that's, of course, a common position. Think of the recent Sri Lankan campaign against Tamils. Because of this consensus about non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, the UN never once considered the Pakistan Army's violent counterinsurgency, despite the vast media attention. We could talk at length about the American media. There were front-page headlines, I think in August, when Senator Kennedy went to the refugee camps in India, met with Indira Gandhi, was very sympathetic to the Bengali and Indian perspective. And the front page, the Washington Post and the New York Times was, Kennedy alleges, genocide in East Pakistan. So it's not something that was just in these cables. It was a public discussion. It was also discussed in Congress. Here it is necessary to distinguish between the nation states that constitute the United Nations, who are almost wholly on the side of Pakistan, and the UN Secretariat, which had to manage the unprecedented refugee crisis. We're talking about up to 10 million refugees, mostly in India, which necessitated relations with the Pakistan government, which had to allow the presence of UN observers and humanitarian agencies within East Pakistan. So the UN could not condemn Pakistan on the one hand and cooperate with it on the other. For all the moral attraction of the British opposition's MPs who advocated humanitarian intervention, it was the conservative government realists, some of you might call them cynics, who highlighted this dilemma, which was faced by the British as well. And I quote Sir Frederick Bennett, who was advocating the government position. I cannot believe that he, Stonehouse, this opposition MP who advocated genocide and humanitarian intervention, meant that the United Nations should in some way use some form of forceful intervention. If such a thing were possible, we should recognize that it would result in loss of life and difficulties in the area. I have been waiting for weeks since the last debate to hear anyone suggest in practical, not theoretical terms, how, on the one hand, aid can be cut to Pakistan and its present de facto government, and on the other, increase to East Pakistan. Whether we like it or not, at the moment, the Pakistan government and the Pakistan Armed Forces are the only institutions available for development aid, or of aid of any kind, which would flow to East Pakistan, etc., etc. And if you read the opposition members' replies, they never really addressed this point. They They deal at the level of moral indignation and appeals to the UN and so forth. You get the structure of this debate in the debate about Darfur, for example, in the last few years as well. This dilemma is one that bedevils the international community today. Then there was the problem that by August 1971, and I discovered this only recently, that the Awami League forces did not want UN observers stationed in East Bengal, and they in fact threatened to kill them as collaborators. When asked by a journalist why, they replied, "When the West Pakistan Army was butchering hundreds of thousands of our people in the past, the United Nations meekly declared that this was an internal matter of Pakistan. Now that the Liberation Army is making some headway, the United Nations intervenes on West Pakistan's behalf." So what of events today? While the President of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, is the subject of an ICC warrant for his part in war crimes in Darfur, he won't be arrested by most of his African neighbouring states for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And critics like Julie Flint, Alex de Waal and Martin Shaw, among others, have pointed out the negative consequences for NGOs operating in Sudan, let alone the difficulties that the indictment creates for managing peace there. It is these and other dilemmas with which government officials, the United Nations and NGOs and the media wrestle when they confront such cases where genocide is alleged and where state sovereignty is at stake or feared to be at stake. There are no easy answers, I think, contrary to some NGOs who want to send in the troops to rescue victims of genocide. In the end, allegations of genocide become a matter of diplomatic haggling, and that's why I'm calling the book I'm writing on this topic, The Diplomacy of Genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk, for a troubling but also illuminating account of the past, which, as I indicated and you reinforced, is also part of the legacy that we deal with today. I'm going to ask the first question, and I'm going to invite people in the audience to weigh in. But I would like to invite you to talk a bit more about the whys. It's easy, and I'm going to guess you're going to say probably overly simplistic, if not downright incorrect, simply to put on one side a group of insensitive, morally blind European British mandarins, and on the other side people who had a clear-cut sense of justice and of right versus wrong. To say I expected something much more than that. I think sometimes people have explained the outside response as a reflection of the way in which the Cold War paradigm influenced so much of international relations in these years. But my suspicion, again, is that that's not a fully satisfying explanation as well. So to the extent, and you've clearly indicated that there wasn't a monolithic response even within, say, the British diplomatic corps, but to the extent you can talk about a essentially European response, or probably more accurately, an essentially diplomatic or official response. Why? Why was it so likely that representatives of Her Majesty's government and doubtless other governments came down in one position rather than the other?
There's a series of complex questions in there, I think. Having now looked briefly, as I skimmed through, as I photographed them, the American cables in the second half of 1971, you can see the convergence between the American and the British positions. I've also copied the German ones, but I haven't studied them yet. And in any event, the Germans aren't a major player here. The British and the Americans are. What's striking is that even in November 1970, as war clouds are gathering, as we know the Indians invaded on the 3rd of December, they are still hoping for a negotiated peace. And
the
Americans and the British diplomats are still talking to the West Pakistani elites trying to get some Awami League leaders who can be mobilized to strike a deal in which a kind of federal Pakistan is a united Pakistan is maintained. In retrospect, this seems naive, but as an historian, we want to understand what the viewpoint of these people on the spot was, and not moralize. I didn't want to give the impression that my paper moralizes about the British, which is why I end with those series of dilemmas. It's all too easy to do that. I mean, the literature on the tilt here in America is, for example, when you look at Seymour Hersh's book, the chapter in Christopher Hitchens' book, which is very derivative of Hersh, and hasn't been able to use the diplomatic cables, is extremely moralistic. It's an anti-Nixon and Kissinger diatribe. But what's clear is, leaving the White House aside, is that the State Department and the people at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office were in close connection, close touch with the West Pakistanis, and were constantly telling them to, were constantly advising restraint. It's as far as they would go. Because of these dilemmas and inhibitions, there's not going to be any public condemnation, for sure. There's this constant sense in the cables that Yahya Khan is extremely touchy. He won't take advice except from personal friends, which means Nixon and people like that. And there's no way that you could lecture him and say, look, this is counterproductive what your army's doing, just stop them. And what's clear is the army, as the campaign unfolds, is probably a law unto itself now. And there's little that Yahya Khan could have done, though I could be wrong there. But the cables also show that the political class in Pakistan is starting to have second thoughts about this. And there's talk of Bhutto destabilizing the situation. Of course, as soon as the war is lost, there's a change of regime in Pakistan. So there's something behind this. So the diplomats know how unstable things are in West Pakistan. They know that they really don't have reliable interlocutors on the Bengali side because they're the government in exiles actually in Calcutta. And what you have left in West Bengal, in East Bengal, in East Pakistan, are complacent or compliant Awami League leaders who may or may not be able to deliver a deal. And they're constantly shuttling back and forth between these different players. And I think reading these cables gives you a sense of the complexities with which the diplomats had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't leave aside the broader geopolitical and economic interests that the British and the Americans had. On the geopolitical side, the story is very clear. They didn't want to see the dismemberment of Pakistan. They also feared that West Pakistan would be dismembered, and the cables show the digging of trenches not far from Islamabad in case the Indians invaded. Kissinger certainly believed that this was a real possibility, and so partition would be reversed in a sense, which then would mean a de facto Soviet win, and this was also a major issue. But this is, I think, common knowledge from experts in the field. I don't think you know, but probably better than I do. How about that for a start?
Okay. Good start.
Okay.
Good start. Bill Milam. Bill, if you'll all wait till Joshua gets you the microphone. I would ask everybody as calling you to identify yourself.
I thought you knew me by now, but my name's Bill Milam, and I'm a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. And I've spent a few years in Bangladesh and a few years in Pakistan, but not during the time that you're talking about, Dirk. By the way, let me say at the very beginning, I think you're onto a really fascinating topic here that can be extremely relevant to our own time. I mean, you mentioned Sudan, and I was thinking towards the end of the difference, it seems to me like, and I don't know much about it, but the difference 25 years made between finally the reaction that we made in what is now the former Yugoslavia, where genocide was declared to be a problem and people were tried, and what happened in 1971. But Sudan, again, is a kind of a middle case, and one has to wonder if geographic or ethnic things don't get involved there, too. Before I have not too many questions, because most of them you couldn't answer without going to the American archives and going further, but a few suggestions. But before I do, I wanted to point out to you that to my left here is the Associated Press reporter in South Asia in 1970 and 71 who was in Dhaka and who was hiding in the hotel along with that British reporter you quote. And he may want to say something along the way, too.
Okay, I look forward to that.
But I'll let him speak for himself. He's always been able to do it before.
Now that you've put him on the spot.
Now that I've put him on the spot. But he doesn't have to. I mean, he could just tell me to shut up. No, never. I wanted to say, I wondered, one of the interesting ramifications nowadays is that all these years later, the Awami League government that has now come back to power in Bangladesh is looking into trying the Jamaat-e-Islami and some of the other Islamists for complicity in genocide. And, of course, one doesn't have to go into the political motivations for this. But I wondered if you had come across anything in your all these things you've looked at about the Islamist participation on the Pakistani side in Bangladesh. I guess that is a question. Let me go on to a statement. I was thinking about this conversation you had with Kamal Hussein, who I know quite well. 2 weeks, you said, before the crackdown when he was talking about genocide. And, I think that you might want to look into, and I mentioned this to you once, this book by Lieutenant Colonel A.R. Siddiqui. I forget what it's called now, but he's the guy who would not have witnessed anything because he was never in the field. But he was in constant touch with Yahya Khan and the people around Yahya Khan, and he writes very, very graphically about their racist feelings, if I can put it that way, about Bengalis. So anybody who had any Bangladeshi like Kamal Hussein, who had been pretty much dealing at the top levels of the Pakistani government, unified Pakistan, would have known of what I think was a very general Punjabi feeling about the inferiority of Bengalis and their Hinduist, if I can use that term, tendencies. And there's another thing that comes to my mind which would have been an indication, and that is that the man who also was a good friend of mine, still is the guy who was the commanding general in East Pakistan up until March the 5th or 6th when he resigned his commission. That was his name is Sahibzada Yaqub Khan. I asked him once why he did that, because he was bound for very high things in the Pakistani army. He said because he could see what was coming. He knew the feelings of the people who were running Pakistan at the time. So I think all of these things are suggestive that there was probably not in their minds, conscious minds, but in their emotions, the likelihood that genocide was on the way. And it's not always clear to me when something that starts out as civil war, insurrection of separatism turns into genocide, but it certainly, the evidence seems to be that it did in this case. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I've gone on too long already, but when you get to the American documents, I understood, I may not be right on this, but I've always understood that, again, like in other subsequent cases, the division, I guess it's called, or the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the State Department, which has always been an outlier and was even up until a few years ago, was dead set against the policy that basically the State Department itself came to enunciate, which came down from the White House about what they called the tilt towards Pakistan. You might want to look at that, because I think there were some dissenting voices within the government, but they didn't, at least far as I know, get out beyond internal memos. I think I'm finished, thanks.
Tremendous, thanks very much.
Let's see if Dirk wants to take on the
Why don't we gather a few?
Okay. All right.
My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and as I've been identified, I was the Associated Press correspondent in Dhaka during this period. Actually, I was the bureau chief for all of Pakistan. One aspect of your remarks interested me because I thought I was covering a civil war that also included genocide, but I noticed you seem to make a distinction between the two, and I wonder if you can clarify that, explain that, why that distinction is necessary. And I have many more things to say, but I'd rather hear you talk.
I'll do that one straight away. Genocides usually do take place within civil wars. But what I was reconstructing here is how it was publicly discussed. As an historian, I'm not a normative thinker. I'm telling you, this is how the British government depicted it, so they could surgically remove genocide from the equation, as if they're separate categories. In fact, they're overlapping categories. So I agree with you. But when you look at the rhetoric of the documents, the speeches and so forth, the British politicians and the senior bureaucrats do their best never to use the word, or when they're forced to use the word, then to somehow argue that it doesn't apply. For all the obvious implications, they had signed a genocide convention, or there is a genocide convention, and that implies some kind of intervention. The last thing they wanted to do, they wanted to negotiate in the kind of normal interstate way, without this kind of agenda or moral imperative. Of course, if you admit that genocide is taking place, you admit that there's an emergency. An emergency means that normal state interactions don't apply. The Security Council has to get involved and all that kind of thing. And they didn't want to do that. In the end, this is why I think their policy was incoherent, India got impatient with, it was intolerable for India to need 10 million refugees for which it had to care. And if Pakistan had been allowed to continue, they would have stayed in India. And then what? So in the end, the Security Council only deals with when the threat of war is really imminent. I think it's in late November. And they call on India for restraint. And this is then too much for the Indian elites, who obviously, opportunistically as well, invade Pakistan to fix the situation from their perspective and from the Bengali perspective. And people who have written about humanitarian intervention, like Michael Walzer, they actually see this as a humanitarian intervention, though I think that's just a rhetorical move. So I hope that answers your question. But I certainly analytically see genocide and civil war overlapping or being mutually imbricated. But rhetorically, they were separated at the time for propaganda reasons, as so far as I can see it. Hazelhurst, whom you probably knew, yes, at the Times, at the London Times, he was very balanced. Was he? Okay. But in terms of the rhetoric, I mean, his balance, he would tell it as he saw it, though I mean, who's going to argue with you? You were there. If you follow his reports in the London Times, he reports the lots of one-sided state military violence against Bengali civilians, but he also reports the massacres of Biharis and also Razakars. You wanted me to talk about them when they were caught. So and Islamists who were pro-unified Pakistan. The cables register what they were doing, which was helping the army. And when they were caught by the Awami League, they were massacred, including their women and children. There was clearly genocidal revenge killing on the side of Bengalis. This is without doubt. And this is what always made it confusing for people how to categorize this violence. Because when people think of genocide, this is in a sense what's coming out generally from my research about the framing of mass violence in the post-war period. People think of the Holocaust, and they think of very one-sided violence where where the victims are passive and agentless and not combatants, Jews, for example. And here there is some resistance. There's a Mukbi Bahini and so forth. And so the Civil War narrative has a lot of weight. Although the International Commission of Jurists, which made its report a year later, it, like the lawyers do, they're very careful and they disaggregate the cases. And they say the Bengali accusation that the campaign as a whole was a genocide is absurd because there's no evinced attention to kill 75 million Bengalis, or even a proportion of them, a large proportion, which is the threshold. But the targeting of the Hindus within the Bengali community was very much evidence, and that aspect was genocidal. And I think they were right. I think that evidence is incontrovertible. And we know from even this UN document, which is used by the British in their brief in mid 1971, they say it too. So they don't publicly communicate that, but they say that. So,
may I add a footnote? Please do. I would like to hear from you.
I came to Pakistan, my assignment to Pakistan, in fact, I opened up the first AP bureau there, was from Nigeria, and I had covered the Biafra Civil War. My first visit to Dhaka was in December of 1969, and I came there right in the middle of an emergency because Biharis and Bengalis were killing each other. And my first long dispatch was... I stated that this was going to be the next Biafra. This was, and of course, 2 years later it happened. And I remember my foreign editor responded to my dispatch by saying, I understand what you're trying to say, but how are they going to get at each other with India in the middle? And I said simply, I don't know, but they will find a way. And they certainly did.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Dirk will collect a couple more questions. Why don't you go ahead and take Bill Milam's question on the Islamists right now?
I think I addressed that a bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, you got it. Okay. Huma?
I'm Huma Yusuf. I'm the Pakistan scholar here at the center. And thank you, Dirk, for your very interesting paper. I have two quick questions. One, which is a follow-up on Arnold's question, which is... in the conversation we're having here, we're sort of splitting up, we're sort of polarizing genocide versus civil war and the choice between that. But in the documents that you quote, there's a whole spectrum of language. There's massacre, there's atrocity, there's tragedy, there's what else did I make note of? There are the ethnic slurs, there's atrocity, communal riots. And I'm wondering whether any of those other terms had political resonance at the time, whether cumulatively all this meant something different, or whether it really was just a choice between genocide versus civil war. And my other question has to do with, you mentioned the fact that partition is brought up as a comparison. And I'm wondering if, in addition to, from what you've read of the British cables, in addition to sort of the broader Cold War geopolitics, whether this sort of institutional memory or colonial guilt from partition guides the decision to sort of not get involved again or pretend to know what's best for the subcontinent at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Huma. Great questions.
Ayla, you want to take one or two more?
Let's take
Anyone
some more.
from this side? Okay, this gentleman right here, and then we'll move over to this side of the table.
Thank you very much. I'm Iftikhar Hussain, work for Voice of America, partial to the Border Region Service that constitute West Pakistan, South and East Afghanistan. Not as a Pakistani, I have some relevance to this issue, but my father was in the army. He fought in East at that time. My question is, why, and it's a big why, since I was asking this my father at that time, that you guys went there to kill your own people? That was my own question, because later on nobody told us in our textbooks about the Pakistan army. It was more about the issue of dismemberment and Bengalis doing something wrong in each and every. But why the UN at that time failed to act against Pakistan, or in some way, not to say against Pakistan, but to save the situation? And secondly, if you have any idea of what was going on in the media at that time, did it influence any of the... Because something of war coming out is only the media that gives you a picture. And did that move the perceptions or the actions? Or thank you very much.
Okay, you got about 4 questions. Why don't we deal with those, and then we'll move over here.
The vocabulary of violence, Huma's first question. The issue with massacres, which comes up quite frequently, as you noted, could be used on both sides. And that fits in with the use of riots and communal violence. And there was a symmetry there, because there were massacres and communal riots on all sides. In a sense, you have a civil war between the West and the East, but you have a civil war within the East. Bengalis versus Biharis, but then also, if you look at the sources, and other people are writing on this now, like Samila Bose and Christian Gerlach, who's got a book called Extremely Violent Societies, which is about out with a long chapter on Bangladesh. Hindus en route to the border with India were systematically robbed, their women raped by Bengali Muslims who opportunistic. I mean, this is a poor society. People robbed and raped each other. The rapes, which were part of the Bengali propaganda against the Pakistan army, were in all directions. Bihari women were raped by Bengali men. Bengali women were raped by Bihari men, and in all directions. I mean, it was a humanitarian catastrophe, and the rhetoric of genocide doesn't suit that because it implies an asymmetry. You know, the West Pakistanis committed, the Punjabis committed genocide against us Bengalis, and that's a staple of the Bengali case until today. You just have to look online at the blogs. It's a live issue. At the time, they used genocide, as I said. Now, the states, that is the U.S. government, parts of the media, but a minority, and the British government, wanted to disaggregate this idea of one-sided genocide by focusing on atrocities on both sides, and so forth. When I gave this paper in Rutgers a few days ago, there was a Turkish student there. She said, "Oh, this is exactly what the Turks say about the Armenian case," and she's completely right. The Turks don't deny there was violence in 1915 against the Armenians, but they say this was a civil war. There was violence on both sides. No one talks about the Muslim victims and so forth. And there was violence against Muslim victims and so forth. What they ignore, though, is there was also a state policy to target civilian members of a particular group whose women and children were held vicariously guilty, collectively and preemptively, for the actions of some militants among them. And once that equation starts to be realized, then you're heading in genocidal direction. But of course, what we're dealing with in this media war in 1971 is not the reasoned debates of academics and the kind of discussion we're having now, where everybody's calm and reasoned. But people are trying to gain moral capital. As for the institutional guilt, I didn't detect any in the British. There's a sense of, these, I mean, they never use the word primitive, savage, or barbaric, but it's hinted at consistently that, well, the Pakistan army, you can't really expect anything more from these people. They've always been like this. And but they're our friends, so we'll do what we can to restrain them, and we won't capitulate to all their demands, but we'll tell them what's what, but we certainly won't condemn them in private. I mean, we won't do anything that will jeopardize our interests. So I don't sense any guilt so far, though I'll look at them with that lens in future, if you like. Now, to your gentleman here, your three very good questions. My discussions with people who grew up in Pakistan are such that this isn't talked about much in the textbooks. And I did read one cable yesterday from the State Department reporting from Islamabad saying that there was no comprehension for the Bengali side at the time because, of course, the population in the West was given the government line. There was censorship. This is a national emergency. They just saw this as an illegitimate rebellion by the inferior Bengalis who were attacking Biharis. And so the army had every right to put them down and prevent a secession. And probably that line has sort of percolated down over the years, or trickled down over the years, though you know better than I do. Now, why did the UN fail to act? Well, I hinted at it a bit earlier. The UN Secretariat was in this dilemma that it needed to deliver humanitarian aid to all these refugees, the biggest refugee crisis that it had ever faced. And to do that, it needed to deal with the Pakistan government. And U Tant, the Secretary General at the time, made it very clear that he would work with the Pakistan government. We have his letters in the UN archives to Yahya Khan. I think the first letter was quite late, actually. And that it was all about establishing a harmonious relationship so UN personnel could get into East Pakistan. Of course, they could get into India via the Indians. And to do that, everything had to be very cordial. and respectful. And, all the letters are prefaced by, of course, we respect your sovereignty and you must decide. And so these are the niceties of the diplomatic correspondence. Now, it's clear that he did want to get people in there, but these are the compromises he needed to make. Having said that, in the particular UN organs, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the Subcommission on the Prevention of Oppression of Minorities, I forget its name at the time, whose minutes you can look at and so forth, although they've been highly cleansed, I discovered when I was in Geneva last year. All the good stuff's been cleaned out. And it's mainly correspondence about travel expenses. But when I ask the people at the archive, they go, of course we destroy all the sensitive stuff. That's the point of the human rights infrastructure at the UN. These committees are not just controlled by the UN Secretariat, but by the member states. And Pakistan was on various of those committees, and whenever it came up, India tried to push it. The Soviets supported them. Occasionally NGOs were pushing it. Pakistan would convince all the other members, and especially Muslim states, that this was illegitimate. And after all, the Americans had had their civil war and no one was complaining about that now. It was extremely violent. Why can't we put down a rebellion or a secession? And they won that argument every time. And so the UN committees which deal with human rights issues never pressed on with it. It would be raised once and that was the end of it. And the Security Council wouldn't deal with this until the very end. Now, the Security Council comprises the great powers. The Soviets were on the Indian side, but it was the Chinese, the British and the Americans were all on the Pakistani side. So there's no way the Security Council was going to take a stand on this. Even though by the middle of June, or the middle of the year, you could have argued that the trigger for Security Council attention, which was that a conflict had become internationalized and disturbed international peace, that it had occurred. Because India was getting extremely upset about this, and not without justice. For all the Indian support of the Mukti Bahini, this was not an Indian conspiracy. That's what the Pakistanis believed at the time, and you read the memoirs of generals, and so they're all in the Library of Congress. It's all just an Indian conspiracy. They don't take any responsibility for what happened. Poor Pakistan. It's pathetic, to be honest, reading this pseudo-scholarship. It's even scholars who say this. You just have to pick up where the book is from, published in Islamabad, such and such university. Sure enough, you leaf through it, and by the end, it's India's fault for everything. Now, this sense of self-pity comes up on all sides. I don't want to pick on the Pakistani elites and academics here. The Indians make the same moves. And it's about time there's some balanced academic debate about this, where the responsibility for all parties for this catastrophe is acknowledged. The media did report the American media, people like Sidney Scharnberg, for example, whom you would have known in the New York Times, consistently reported the extent of the West Pakistani violence. It also talked about the violence against Biharis, but mainly the army violence, and there the genocide narrative was supported. But it had no effect on the great powers, had no effect on the General Secretary at the United Nations. I've even managed to find in the archives a meeting where the head of the diplomatic corps based at the UN just puts it to him and says, look, this is about May, there's a catastrophe unfolding and you're not doing anything other than talking about humanitarian relief, which is not a political issue. And he gives this waffling, dissembling answer. I mean, it's clear he realizes that he cannot condemn Pakistan publicly for what's going on because it would jeopardize his ability to do the humanitarian work. That's my reading of it. Now, the culture in the UN is different today. There's a special rapporteur on genocide and so forth. This is all the product of the 90s. You talked about Yugoslavia. But that's a learning process that the international community had to go through. Incidentally, I think there's little that these people at the UN could do. I mean, if the nation states of the world, the great powers, don't want intervention, it's not going to happen.
Let's see. Did I say hand over here? Okay, we'll go back over here to this gentleman here, and then to you, Mr. Ahmed, and this will probably be the last two we can have.
Yeah, I'm Nasir Khilji with the U.S. Treasury Department. I'm an economist. Actually, thank you for taking us down memory lane, although it's a very one-sided thing from the British side, and how the British, especially the British government and the opposition, reacted to that. There were some terms that you use, and I would caution, I'm a West Pakistani according to that logic, but we have to keep in mind, as we all know here, that West Pakistan is not a homogeneous country. There are basically 4 different ethnic things, like the Bengalis, you have Balochis, the Pathans. I've never figured out who I am. I think I'm from the frontier. I'm a Pathan, but still, like there are Sindhis also and so on. So when you say West Pakistan or Punjabis, one has to be very careful what we are talking about.
So I'm reflecting what the documents say.
Okay, yeah,
sense.
but at least I think there are a couple of things I just wanted to highlight here. First of all, as we know, I was a student at that time in Pakistan, West Pakistan that is, and we were victimized by the military. There was a military dictatorship that had started in 1958. So when you say Pakistan, there was no way that there was a representative government that was acting on behalf of Pakistanis like myself. There was a military dictatorship. If you look at the history over the last 38 years, and Woodrow Wilson has been witness to this, it's been to geopolitical interest by the U.S. and Britain and others that we've had a host of military regimes there who've made a whole series of mistakes and who've been accommodated by the U.S. and the Brits and so on. So keeping all that in mind, we have to be very careful in our vocabulary. It was not a genocide between the Pakistanis and the Bengalis, number one. Why? Because the Pakistanis never elected Yahya Khan. So when Yahya Khan was acting, he may have had some elites on him, but you cannot use Punjabis or West Pakistanis or Pakistanis fighting against
You're worried about stigmatizing issues. I mean,
No, but I think, as a historian, one has to be very clear
of course, I don't make
that
these
there
kind
was
of
a military regime which was victimizing Pakistan.
What do you think Ali Bhutto's position on the
Ali
campaign
Bhutto,
was?
again, okay, that's another thing that you want to definitely do research on, and I would invite you to look at his whole thing in there, because I don't want to distract from the main issue today, which has to be the British.
But if Ali Bhutto's in favour of
the British view.
But if Ali Bhutto's in favour of the military campaign, and the military is, I mean, that's a large part of the Pakistan political class.
But keep in mind, Maulana Bashani has a big role to play here. It's a big history, and actually it's very interesting, and I agree with a lot of things that you've said. And I think you've been very fair-minded about the whole thing. You haven't characterized it as a genocide, number one, which I agree. You've characterized it as a civil war, which may have been, but remember, it was a military composed of basically generals who are elitist, foisted on by British and American aid for geopolitical interests, and we've had that with Musharraf, with Ziaul Haq. There have been a whole series of military dictators, and you cannot use their actions to represent in any shape or form what the Pakistanis like myself or others said.
Sir,
they were never elected.
we understand the point. Did you have a question? Because we're out of time.
Okay. So essentially, that's the first thing I wanted to point out, that we have to be very careful about how we characterize that. Okay. The second question is, my question basically is, when you look at the British view about it, do you think that this has, again, I think I'll probably stop here. The reason being that I just want to clarify and urge you to be very careful about when you say Pakistanis against the Bengalis and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. If you'll pass the mic to your left. No, that's your other, sorry, your right. No, it is your left.
Okay.
Your other left.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Raihan Ahmed. I'm a Bangladeshi American, and I was 6-year-old in 1971, and I lived in Dhaka, and I witnessed the dead bodies crossing my neighborhood, going to the graveyard, and I still vividly remember that day. But I don't know that incidentally or coincidentally, today is the Victory Day. 5 hours ago, Bangladesh celebrated its 39th Victory Day, and I'd like to pay tribute to all the martyrs, freedom fighters, and really appreciate Woodrow Wilson Center to bring this critical issue. At this point, after 39 years, we have not seen justice who committed. So is the issue about the genocide and all this, my question is, I didn't see anything about your presentation that how did it happen, the whole election process, the majority mandate came in March. I'll basically ask you to look at the Father of Nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's his March 7th address to the nation. And what happened on March 25th, the huge massacre. Within the next 2 weeks, Pakistani army brought all those military equipments and military personnel, and on March 25th, they started massacres. And I witnessed that massacre. We started fleeing from the city and I was 6-year-old. I can remember how we are like taking shelters and how we are fleeing different places. And so this is a huge issue, that why the British, because we're now focusing on the British documents, that why the British are not looking at the smooth transition, because they are mandated in 1970 that Awami League will take over the power. That's the history. So what happened?
Let me interrupt here, because it is, I don't want to keep everybody past the time, and let's give Dr. Moses the last word. Thank you. That's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your sharing of your experiences. Perhaps you two need to have a bit of a chat to iron out where you agree. I mean, I think you both agree that this violence took place. What you call it is another question. The first gentleman, is anxious that generalizations aren't made about the Pakistani people and so forth. And I think it does need to be acknowledged that this was not a popular campaign by every West Pakistani against all people in
4 ethnic groups of Pakistan.
Yes, yeah, which come up incidentally in the cables. The Americans are of course worried about the stability of the West, and they talk about Ali Bhutto's playing off of the different regions against each other, and they're worried about that. They want to keep stability above all. What's clear is that many people in the army, and then many people in Bengal, talked about each other in these generalized, if you like, racialized terms. So that's in the sources, and we need to acknowledge that, okay? We don't need to participate in that today. I gave a paper on a particular slice into this history. The paper was long enough as it is, so I couldn't give you a blow-by-blow account of the constitutional negotiations in January and February and March 1970. I don't think that's what people wanted to hear here. And enough has been written about that, or a lot. So, but I'm glad you shared your personal experience with us. When I gave this talk a few weeks ago at Rutgers, a young woman whose father came from rural East Bengal explained what her father had relayed to her, the army coming into the village, and he lied and said he was a Muslim, and so they were spared and so forth. And the good thing is no one seems to deny the extent of the violence. Although I didn't talk about this, the talk of 3 million casualties is clearly inflated and needs to be subject to scientific scrutiny. But once we get back to the facts, and a new book by Samila Bose called Dead Reckoning is coming out, which investigates each of the claims of massacres and so forth, then I think we can begin the kind of discussion that needs to happen in South Asia. Having said that, I'm not from South Asia. I'm not an expert on South Asia. It's far be it from me to tell people there how to deal with their issues. I'm an historian who's interested in how these issues are regarded in international relations, which is also, as we know, an important factor. Today was just on the British. I could write an entire book just on the American side. Most important, perhaps, is for people from your part of the world to write in a scientific way how people experienced it. That's an important part of the equation, and without that, any writing about genocide is sort of bloodless, to use the one of a better word. So thank you for your contributions today.
In fact, Dirk's last comment said what I was going to say, which was simply that at the end of the day, history is about people. And participants will have varying recollections and varying understandings of what happened, but I think it's important that we not forget that we're talking about what happened to real flesh and blood people. That's clearly part, and so the contributions made by several of you are important. So thank you. I think you've seen an example today why we feel that we were so fortunate to have Dirk Moses with me. So if you'll join me in a round of applause for him.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dirk, we have enjoyed having you here. We regret the fact that you are going to leave us next week, but we certainly welcome you back. One last word. Dirk Dirk mentioned a new book that's coming out in 1971 by Professor Bose. We're hosting her here in March. I think it's March 15th, though I'm not sure, where she'll talk about her new book. If any of you did not get an email invitation to this event, if you'll give Joshua, raise your hand. If you'll give Joshua your email address, we'll make sure you get an invitation to that event as well. Thanks for being with us today. We're dismissed.